Close your eyes, if you wish, and imagine yourself stepping softly into another century. The year is 1862, and the city before you is London, vast and restless, yet wrapped tonight in the quiet embrace of winter. The air carries a sharp chill, the sort that finds its way through layers of wool and lingers in the bones. But it also holds a certain stillness, the peculiar calm of a city subdued by frost. The cobblestones beneath your feet glisten faintly, darkened by a thin glaze of ice. Overhead, the gas lamps cast small circles of wavering light, harmless in the mist that drifts like pale curtains across the streets. A carriage rattles by in the distance, its wheels crunching over frozen ruts, and the soft clop of hooves fades quickly into the muffled hush of the night. The great metropolis does not sleep, not truly, but on evenings like this, it seems to hold its breath, the rhythm of life slowed by the cold. Step carefully now, and let us wander. We begin on the edge of a narrow street, where small shops close their shutters against the chill. A baker sweeps snow from his doorway, though the warmth of his ovens has long since died down for the day. The last of the evening's loaves has already been sold to housewives and errand boys, who scurried away clutching warm bundles against the frosty air. Across the street, a solitary lamplighter moves steadily along his rote, raising his pole to coax a flame into life, one lamp at a time. His breath fogs the air, curling into shapes that linger for a moment before vanishing into the night. The winter of 1862 is not unusual, though that is precisely the point. In this city, winter is never a casual visitor. It is a force, one that shapes the daily existence of all who live here. From the richest family in Belgravia to the poorest child sheltering beneath a railway arch. The Victorians accepted its presence as both curse and companion. They prepared for it as best they could, layering wool and lighting fires. But they also braced themselves, knowing that the cold could be as merciless as it was beautiful. Look closely, and you can see the way the frost clings to every surface. Iron railings sparkle faintly, the frozen sheen catching the lamplight. The windows of public houses glow warmly from within, golden squares of comfort in the grey of night. If you pause near one, you may hear the faint murmur of voices, laughter rising above the clatter of tankards, a pocket of cheer that resists the season's hardships. Yet not far away, tucked in the shadows, a beggar curls into herself, the thin fabric of her shawl offering little defense against the cold. For her, winter is not a picturesque backdrop, but a daily trial of survival. Let us walk further, toward the river. The Thames lies shrouded in mist, its black waters moving sluggishly under the weight of the season. On certain nights, the fog thickens until it blurs the very outlines of the bridges, reducing them to ghostly arches in the gloom. The cold sharpens here, damp and biting, creeping under collars and cuffs. It is easy to imagine why Victorian newspapers often wrote of the river as though it were alive, a creature whose moods could dictate the fate of the city. But winter in London is not only hardship and gloom. There is also wonder to be found if one looks with patient eyes. Imagine the first snowfall of the season. The way the flakes descend silently through the smoky air, settling on rooftops, softening the harsh lines of chimneys and spires. For a short while, the city becomes a canvas of white, its noise subdued, its dirt concealed. Children delight in the transformation, rolling snowballs and tracing their names along railings. Lovers stroll arm in arm, their steps slow, savoring the beauty of the moment. Even the stern facades of government buildings and warehouses take on a gentler aspect beneath the snow's quiet veil. This, then, is the paradox of Victorian winter, cruel yet enchanting, grim yet capable of sudden beauty. It is a season that magnifies contrasts between rich and poor, warmth and cold, life and death. It is no wonder that writers and poets of the era return to it again and again, finding in its icy grip both inspiration and dread. Charles Dickens, who knew the London winter intimately, filled his works with snowbound streets and foggy mornings, images that have since become inseparable from the very idea of Victorian life. As you listen, let the pace slow further. We are not rushing anywhere. Think of this as a gentle stroll through time, where each detail has space to breathe. The rhythm of footsteps on frozen cobblestones, the faint glow of gaslight in the mist, the quiet crackle of coal fires in unseen hearths. All of these things form the backdrop of a world that is both familiar and strange. In the chapters to come, we will explore this world more deeply. We will trace the roots of the cold itself, back to the long reach of the Little Ice Age. We will wander through frost fairs on the Thames, step carefully through smog-choked fogs, and sit by firesides where hot drinks and stories brought solace against the darkness outside. We will glimpse the hardships of the poor, the entertainments of the wealthy, and the odd, enduring fascination that Victorians held for ice, snow, and the wintry season as a whole. For now, though, simply rest here at the threshold. The year is 1862. The night is cold. London waits before us, silent and shrouded, ready to reveal its frozen secrets one chapter at a time. And as you breathe slowly, let the city's winter settle around you like a blanket. There will be time enough to explore. Tonight, we have only just begun our journey. Before we walk further into the snowbound streets of Victorian London, we must pause to look behind us, far back into the centuries that shaped this climate and gave the city its peculiar winters. For the cold that gripped London in the 1800s was not an isolated quirk of weather, nor merely a passing inconvenience. It was part of something much larger, a long and curious chapter in the Earth's story, known as the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age was not an ice age, in the dramatic sense of glaciers swallowing continents, but rather a prolonged dip in temperatures that stretched roughly from the mid-1500s until the mid-1800s. Across Europe and North America, winters grew longer, harsher, and more unpredictable. Crops failed in sudden cold snaps, rivers that once flowed freely turned to glass, and whole communities learned to adapt to a chillier rhythm of life. London was no exception. Indeed, it became one of the places where the effects of this cooling period were felt most keenly and most memorably. If you imagine the Thames River today, wide and constantly in motion, it may be hard to picture it freezing solid. Yet during the height of the Little Ice Age, the river did just that, sometimes locking into ice so thick that it could support the weight of markets, tents, and even parading elephants. The famous frost fairs, which we will visit more closely in later chapters, were direct gifts of this colder age. For weeks on end, Londoners of all classes would take to the frozen river, turning it into a festival ground of bright stalls, roasting fires, and merriment. But beneath the surface joy was a reminder of how vulnerable life was to the whims of climate. A frozen Thames, after all, was not simply a curiosity. It disrupted trade, halted shipping, and threatened those who depended on the river for their livelihoods. Bargemen, ferrymen, and dock workers often suffered loss of income during these frosty spells. And while the fairs sparkled with charm, for those who could afford roasted ox or printed souvenirs, countless others struggled to keep warm in unheated rooms with little more than rags for insulation. By the time Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, the Little Ice Age was already fading. The most dramatic freezes had passed, and the Thames would never again harden quite as it once had. Yet its legacy lingered in the city's winters. Though the great river fairs were a thing of memory, the climate still carried the fingerprints of that long chill. Snowfall remained heavier than it does today, frosts lingered longer, and bitter cold was a familiar presence each year. Newspapers of the era often treated these cold snaps with a curious mixture of fascination and dread. Readers devoured stories of blizzards burying streets, of carriages overturned in icy ruts, of pipes bursting in elegant townhouses. At the same time, writers conjured romantic imagery of snowy parks, twinkling gas lamps in frosted fog, and families gathered around glowing hearths. The Victorians, like us, were divided in their feelings about winter, wary of its dangers, yet enchanted by its beauty. One cannot underestimate how much climate shaped culture. The very rhythms of London life were dictated by the seasons, and winter especially pressed itself upon the imagination. Painters captured snowy street scenes. Poets wrote of muffled nights and icy mornings. Novelists, most famously Charles Dickens, set their tales against a backdrop of frost and fog. The Christmas imagery that Dickens helped popularize, crackling fires, falling snow, and festive gatherings, owes as much to the lingering influence of the Little Ice Age as it does to holiday tradition itself. Consider, too, the way buildings were constructed. Houses of the period were built with fireplaces in nearly every room, their tall chimneys a defining feature of the skyline. Coal, imported in vast quantities, fueled these fires, but it also filled the city with smoke that mixed with the winter fog to create the infamous pea-soupers. Thus, the very effort to keep warm contributed to another hallmark of London's winter's dense, choking smog. In this way, climate and human response became entangled, each amplifying the other. As we think about the Little Ice Age, it is worth remembering that its effects were not confined to London. Across Europe, records tell of vineyards withering in unexpected frosts, of canals in the Netherlands freezing so firmly that skaters glided for miles, of alpine glaciers advancing into valleys that had been green for generations. These changes shaped economies, diets, and even political decisions. Harsh winters could bring hunger, unrest, and migration. Yet they also inspired ingenuity. From new methods of food preservation to the widespread use of glass greenhouses in Britain, which allowed delicate plants to survive in spite of the cold. And so, when Victorians trudged through snow-filled alleys or huddled close to coal fires, they were, in a sense, heirs to centuries of colder weather. The memory of the Little Ice Age lingered in the culture, in the architecture, in the stories passed down of rivers turned to ice and fairs held upon their frozen surface. Even as the climate began to warm, ever so slightly toward the end of the 19th century, Londoners spoke of winter with the gravitas of a city shaped by generations of frost. Let us return now to that vision of London in the 1860s. The air is damp, the wind sharp. It may not rival the deepest freezes of earlier centuries, but it is cold enough to make every breath visible, cold enough to creep beneath doorways and window panes. The lamps glow faintly in the fog, and the cobblestones are slick beneath our boots. Somewhere nearby, a church bell tolls, muffled by the mist. This is the winter that Victorians knew, softened by time compared to the fiercest decades of the Little Ice Age, but still marked by its lingering chill. In the chapters ahead, we will walk further into this world, exploring not only the scientific and social dimensions of winter, but the lived experience of those who endured it. We will listen to the street cries of vendors in the cold, peer into the lives of children who worked and played in icy alleys, and wander through the frozen fogs that gave the city its most haunting reputation. For now, simply hold this thought: the winters of Victorian London were not accidents of weather. They were the echoes of a much larger story, a global cooling that had shaped the city for centuries. The frost on the window pane, the smoke rising from countless chimneys, the hush of snow falling in the night, all of these were threads woven into a tapestry that stretched far beyond London itself. As we leave this chapter, let the image settle in your mind: a city shaped by cold, softened by snow, and defined, in no small part, by the lingering breath of the Little Ice Age. There is a particular magic to the first true snowfall of winter, a hush that falls over even the busiest of cities, when the air fills with drifting flakes. For Londoners of the Victorian age, this moment carried both wonder and foreboding. Snow was beautiful, yes, but it was also the herald of hardships to come. It promised scenes of charm, yet it also meant streets grown treacherous, roofs bowed under white weight, and fires that must be fed endlessly to keep out the cold. Still, for a time, when the first snow descended from a grey sky, there was no sound quite like it. The city seemed to exhale. The usual rumble of wheels and clatter of boots softened into silence. Imagine, if you will, an evening in December of 1864. The day has been dreary, the kind of day where a pale sun never quite breaks through the haze. As twilight gathers, the first flakes begin to fall. At first, Londoners scarcely notice. A boy glances upward, his cap already damp from mist, and squints at the new white flecks swirling down. A woman waiting for a horse, drawn omnibus, brushes a powdery dust from her cloak and smiles faintly. But soon, the snow thickens, drifting steadily until the air itself seems filled with tiny white stars. The city reacts in its own ways. Children cheer and rush into the streets, their laughter carrying above the muffled stillness. They chase one another, scooping up handfuls of snow to form crude balls, tossing them with shrieks of delight. For them, snow means play, the promise of sliding on pavements or building crooked snowmen in small courtyards. But for the drivers of carriages, the scene is less cheerful. Wheels slip on the icy cobblestones, horses snort and stamp nervously, and drivers lean low with their whips, trying to maintain control. Omnibuses, those lumbering double-decked carriages, slow to a crawl, their lanterns glowing dimly through the thickening storm. Shopkeepers hurry to shutter their doors, sweeping snow from their thresholds before it drifts too high. The scent of roasting chestnuts lingers in the air, where vendors remain, their braziers glowing like islands of warmth in the white. Street sellers cry their wares more loudly than usual, competing with the snow's hush. Hot pies, gingerbread, roasted potatoes. Each voice seems softened, as though wrapped in wool, and the snowflakes settle even on the vendors themselves, collecting on shawls and caps, until they look as though they too belong to the season. There is, in these first hours of snowfall, a beauty that few could deny. Even the dingiest alley is transformed. The soot-stained brick walls acquire a gentle frosting, the uneven rooftops wear snowy caps, and the gas lamps flicker through a haze of white like distant stars on earth. London, often grey and grimy, becomes for a night a winter painting. Writers of the time often remarked upon this transformation. Newspaper columnists, otherwise given to stern commentary, indulged in lyrical accounts of snow settling upon Seine, Paul's Dome, or blanketing the long stretches of Regent Street. Yet beneath the poetry lay practical concerns. Snow made travel nearly impossible in certain districts. Bridges grew slippery, side streets became blocked by drifts, and the poor who trudged through the storm often arrived at their destinations soaked and shivering. In wealthier neighborhoods, servants hurried to clear paths before the grand homes, pushing snow into heaps that soon froze solid. In poorer quarters, where no such labor was available, the snow remained, compacted into dangerous ice by countless feet. Still, for one evening, there was enchantment. Consider Hyde Park, where the great trees stood dark against the whitened ground, their branches traced in delicate lines of frost. Couples walked slowly beneath the falling flakes, their breath mingling with the mist. The crunch of boots beneath them softened into rhythm. In the distance, the Serpentine glittered faintly, not yet frozen but already edged with frost, foreshadowing the skating parties that would come with deeper cold. Inside homes, families gathered to watch the snowfall through frosted panes. In cramped tenements, children pressed their noses to cracked windows, marveling at the transformation outside. In townhouses, shutters were pulled back, so that parlors glowed warmly into the night, the flicker of firelight reflecting upon the snow. Servants hurried to bring in more coal, while mistresses admired the scene, perhaps already thinking of sleigh rides or outdoor amusements that the weather might bring. For writers like Dickens, this moment was rich with symbolism. Snow could cloak the harshness of poverty, if only for a few hours, hiding the grime and decay beneath a temporary veil of purity. It could also stand as a reminder of fleeting joy, beauty that passed quickly, melting into slush by morning. In his stories, the first snow often heralded both wonder and hardship, a duality that Victorians understood well. As the night deepens, the city settles into quiet. The cries of vendors fade, the last carriages vanish from the streets, and the snow continues its patient descent. The rooftops are thick with white now, the gutters edged with icicles. The lamps burn more dimly, their glow diffused by the curtain of flakes. Somewhere, a church bell tolls the hour, its sound softened into the vast hush. For those walking home, the world feels strangely new. Familiar streets made unfamiliar by their shimmering disguise. Yet even as London sleeps beneath this fresh snowfall, the challenges of the coming days are already taking shape. By morning, the snow will have turned to slush in some places, a filthy mixture of soot and ice that clings to boots and hems. The poor will suffer most, their shoes soaked, their thin clothing offering little defense against the cold. Accidents will increase as carriages skid and pedestrians slip. And yet, for a few precious hours on this first snowy night, the city belongs not to hardship but to wonder. Let the image linger in your mind, a Victorian street, hushed and transformed. The lamps glow faintly, the air is filled with drifting flakes, and the cobblestones shine with a pale sheen. You stand there, listening to the quiet, watching as the snow remakes the city into something both familiar and strange. This is the first snowfall of the season, the moment when winter declares itself, at once beautiful and forbidding. And so, London in winter reveals its nature, a place of contrasts, where hardship and beauty walk side by side. If snow was the painter of Victorian London, laying soft blankets of white across its rooftops and streets, then fog was its shrouded companion, a ghostly veil that blurred every outline, dimmed every light, and transformed the city into something otherworldly. Frost etched delicate patterns on windows and railings, but fog was the more mysterious force, creeping silently through alleyways and squares until all of London seemed suspended in a twilight dream. The Victorians had a word for these dense, smoky fogs, pea-soupers. The term arose not from poetry but from practicality. The thick yellow, green mists, born of coal smoke mingling with natural fog, resembled the very soup that Londoners ate in cheap taverns. To step into one was to enter a world where vision ended only a few feet ahead, where familiar streets became mazes, and where every lantern glowed faintly like a candle held beneath a shroud. Imagine a morning in January 1873. You open your door and are met not with crisp air and pale sunlight, but with a heavy wall of mist. It clings to your clothing and seeps into your lungs. The cobblestones are slick with frost, and each breath forms a cloud that vanishes into the greater cloud all around you. A lamplighter passes, his pole raised, but the glow he coaxes into being seems swallowed whole. You step forward carefully, boots crunching on ice, and soon even the outlines of nearby houses fade into obscurity. For those who lived and worked in London, fog was not a novelty. It was a constant presence, especially in the colder months, when coal fires blazed in countless hearths and chimneys. The poor burned whatever fuel they could find: soft coal, damp wood, even refuse. All of it fed the smoky haze. Frost made it worse, weighing down the particles, trapping them close to the ground. Entire days could pass beneath a dim and choking pall. And yet, for all its dangers, fog carried a strange allure. Poets described it as a cloak that lent the city an air of mystery. Painters tried to capture its shifting forms: hazy bridges, blurred spires, and dimly glowing lamps. Writers turned it into metaphor, a symbol of uncertainty, of hidden truths, of the blurred line between wealth and poverty that characterized Victorian life. Nowhere did fog feel more at home than in the pages of detective stories, where villains slipped away unseen and heroes stalked shadows through the mist. Still, the fog was no mere backdrop. It disrupted daily life in very real ways. Carriages moved at a crawl, their drivers straining to see even a yard ahead. Pedestrians lost their way, stumbling into gutters or colliding with strangers. Accidents were frequent. Horses slid on icy cobbles, carts overturned, and in some cases people wandered into the Thames itself, mistaking the embankment for a street. Newspapers reported these incidents with grim regularity, and families prayed for the safe return of loved ones whenever the fog descended thick and sudden. In wealthier neighborhoods, fog could seem almost picturesque. Families watched it swirl from behind tall windows, children tracing circles on frosted glass while servants stoked fires. But in the crowded rookeries of the East End, the fog seeped into rooms where no fires burned, mingling with damp walls and bare floors. For the poor, each foggy night meant colder bones, harsher coughs, and the gnawing uncertainty of whether tomorrow would bring relief or more of the same. Frost, too, played its part. It silvered the iron railings of Kensington and the humble wooden fences of Whitechapel alike. Water pumps froze solid, and buckets cracked with ice. On the riverbanks, frost crept across wooden piers until they gleamed in the dim light, treacherous to the first unwary step. And yet, in the parks, frost lent a delicate beauty. Grass sparkling with tiny crystals, branches outlined in white lace. Early risers would pause to admire these fragile scenes, knowing they would vanish with the first breath of sun. One of the curious things about fog is its ability to mute sound. In a thick pea-soup, the clamor of London, usually so relentless, seemed softened, as though the city were holding its breath. The cries of street, cellars, the rumble of wagons, even the tolling of bells came muffled, stripped of their sharp edges. Some described it as peaceful, almost dreamlike. Others found it unsettling, a silence that hinted at unseen dangers. Either way, the fog imposed a rhythm of slowness, forcing all to move with care. It is easy, lying here in imagination, to let such a fog settle around you. Picture yourself walking slowly through it, the dampness on your face, the faint halo of a lamp ahead, the crunch of frost beneath your boots. Shapes loom and vanish. A horse's breath hangs in the air like smoke. Somewhere unseen, a child coughs, and then there is silence again. Time feels suspended. The world shrinks to a circle only a few steps wide, and beyond it lies nothing but haze. For Victorians, such experiences were ordinary, yet they left a lasting impression on the city's identity. Even today, when the Thames no longer freezes and modern laws have cleared the air of coal smoke, the idea of London cloaked in fog persists. It lingers in films, novels, and collective imagination, a symbol of a city both mysterious and enduring. And so, when we speak of Victorian winters, we must speak of fog and frost, of the veil that blurred the city's edges, of the chill that etched its mark on every surface. Together, they shaped daily life, creating scenes at once haunting and strangely serene. As we close this chapter, let the image rest in your mind, a lamp, glowing dimly in the haze, frost sparkling faintly on iron railings, and the city itself softened into dreamlike silence. London, in winter, was never entirely clear. It was always a place half in shadow, half in light, a city of frost and fog. If winter pressed heavily on London as a whole, it pressed hardest upon those who lived in the city's poorest quarters. The vast rookeries and tenements of the East End and Southwark, with their narrow alleys and crumbling walls, were places where cold was not simply an inconvenience, but a daily adversary. In these crowded districts, the season stripped away whatever small comfort life might otherwise allow. Step with me gently into one such place. It is late evening, the air outside brittle with frost. You turn into a lane barely wide enough for two people to pass. The stones beneath your boots are slick with frozen slush, and the walls on either side seem to lean inward, shutting out the sky. A doorway gapes open, its wood swollen with damp, and you step inside. The stairway is steep, narrow, and unlit. Your hand trails along a wall rough with peeling plaster. The air smells of soot, cabbage, and the sharp tang of unwashed bodies. Somewhere above, a baby cries. Somewhere below, a man coughs with a rattling sound that echoes in the stairwell. You climb slowly, hearing the creak of boards beneath your feet, until you reach a landing where several doors open into small, dark rooms. Within these rooms, families huddle against the coal. Some crowd around a tiny grate where scraps of coal smolder, giving off more smoke than heat. Others have no fire at all, relying on layers of worn blankets, patched coats, or simply the warmth of bodies pressed close together. Windows, when they exist, are often cracked, their frames stuffed with rags to block the drafts. Frost gathers on the glass, delicate white patterns that glitter faintly in the dim light of a single candle. The cold is a constant presence. It seeps through brick and stone, finds its way beneath doors, and lingers in every breath. Children shiver, their hands red and raw, their toes numb inside worn boots. Mothers pull them close, trying to shield them with thin shawls. Men return from long hours of labor, shoulders stooped, only to find that the room they enter is scarcely warmer than the street outside. The poor of London fought their winters not with roaring fires and thick curtains, but with endurance, layer upon layer of endurance. Food, too, grew scarcer in the cold months. Potatoes and bread were staples, but when wages were low or work was absent, even these were uncertain. Many relied on soup kitchens or charitable relief, queuing in the cold for a ladle of thin broth. In some households, the evening meal might be nothing more than tea without milk, bread without butter, or scraps begged from a market stall at closing time. Hunger deepened the bite of winter. Illness spread easily in such conditions. Damp rooms bred coughs that rarely healed, and crowded tenements ensured that once sickness entered, it touched nearly everyone. Tuberculosis, influenza, bronchitis, all found easy homes in the lungs of those already weakened by hunger and cold. Doctors were few, fees were high, and medicine was often out of reach. Instead, neighbors shared remedies of mustard plasters, onion poultices, or hot bricks wrapped in cloth, doing what they could against ailments that defied such small measures. And yet, even here, life continued. Children still played, inventing games in narrow yards or frozen alleys. They slid on patches of ice, their laughter bright against the gloom, until a parent's voice called them back inside. Women chatted as they scrubbed laundry in cold water, their hands raw and chapped. Men gathered in public houses for warmth as much as for ale, trading news and complaints beneath the smoke, blackened rafters. Hardship did not extinguish human spirit, though it pressed it low. Visitors from wealthier districts sometimes came to witness these conditions. Social reformers, writers, or clergymen determined to expose the reality of urban poverty. They described rooms so crowded that entire families slept side by side on a single straw mattress, with no space for privacy or relief. They wrote of walls damp with mildew, ceilings dripping, and floors where rats scurried openly. In winter, these places grew even harsher, the damp turning to ice, the air to misty clouds with every breath. Consider, for a moment, how different life was only a few miles away. In the West End, families dined in brightly lit parlors, with coal fires roaring in every room, and thick carpets beneath their feet. Curtains kept out the drafts, servants brought trays of hot food, and carriages carried them through the snow. Meanwhile, in the East, thousands shivered through nights, with neither warmth nor certainty of tomorrow's bread. London was a city of stark contrasts, and in winter, those contrasts sharpened like frost on glass. Still, amidst the cold and hardship, there were moments of quiet resilience. A mother tucking her child beneath a patched quilt. Neighbors pooling coins to buy coal enough for one shared fire. A hymn sung softly in a mission hall, voices rising together against the cold. Even in the rookery's dimmest corners, the human heart sought warmth, if not from hearth, then from one another. Let us linger in this picture for a while. A single room, dimly lit, crowded with life. A kettle rattles faintly on a weak flame. Frost gathers at the window pane. A child stirs in sleep, curling closer to a sibling for warmth. Outside, the fog presses against the city, thick and unrelenting, but inside this cramped space there is a fragile, flickering determination to endure. This, too, was London in winter. Brutal, yes, but never entirely without its small sparks of humanity. If the winters of Victorian London weighed heavily upon the poor, they settled quite differently upon the wealthy. For those with means, the season was less a battle for survival, and more an occasion for displays of comfort and refinement. Though the cold pressed in upon every corner of the city, it was softened in the drawing rooms of Mayfair and Kensington, where coal fires roared in marble hearths and heavy curtains muffled the draughts. Step with me now, away from the smoke, blackened rookeries, and into one such home. The house rises tall and proud from a quiet square, its stone facade dusted lightly with frost. Iron railings gleam faintly in the lamplight, and as you ascend the front steps, a butler in dark livery opens the door with practiced grace. Warmth spills out at once, mingled with the faint sense of polished wood, beeswax, and spiced wine. Inside, the contrast is striking. The floors are laid with thick carpets, muffling every step. The walls are adorned with gilt-framed paintings, their colors glowing in the light of chandeliers. Fires burn steadily in polished grates, tended by servants who ensure the flames never falter. The air here is warm, almost stifling compared to the sharp chill outside, and one might almost forget the hardships winter brought beyond these walls. In the drawing room, family members gather as evening falls. Ladies recline upon sofas draped with embroidered throws, their gowns of silk or velvet gleaming in the firelight. Gentlemen stand nearby, discussing the day's news with cigars in hand, while children play quietly on the carpet with toy soldiers or wooden dolls. A pianoforte rests in one corner, its lid propped open, and soon a daughter sits to play, filling the room with soft notes that drift upward into the high ceiling. Meals, too, reflected the season's bounty, at least for those who could afford it. Dinner tables groaned beneath platters of roasted meats, tureens of steaming soup, and bowls of preserved fruits. Wine flowed freely, and the chill of winter outside seemed far away, when one sat before a course of hot puddings or sipped mulled claret infused with cinnamon and orange peel. To dine in such surroundings was to embrace winter not as a hardship, but as a theater for comfort and abundance. The wealthy also found pleasure in winter entertainments. Carriages conveyed them through snowy streets to theaters glowing with light, to concerts where the works of Handel or Mendelssohn echoed through grand halls, or to glittering balls where chandeliers sparkled above polished dance floors. Ice skating, too, enjoyed a fashionable revival. Frozen ponds in Hyde Park drew well-dressed crowds, gliding gracefully in fur-lined cloaks and mufflers, their laughter ringing in the crisp air. Even within their homes, winter brought diversions. Ladies embroidered beside the fire, working intricate patterns into silks. Gentlemen retired to libraries lined with books, where the crackle of a fire accompanied quiet evenings of reading. Children pressed their noses to frosted windows, watching flakes tumble down, their imaginations stirred by tales of snowy adventures. The very cold that brought misery elsewhere became, in these settings, a picturesque backdrop for leisure. But let us not imagine that comfort came effortlessly. Fires consumed mountains of coal, and wealthy households relied on a retinue of servants to maintain the illusion of effortless warmth. Scullery maids rose before dawn to stoke kitchen ranges, while footmen carried scuttles of coal to drawing rooms and bedrooms alike. Without this unseen labor, even the grandest home would soon feel the same chill as the street outside. The difference lay not only in wealth, but in the human hands that made comfort possible. For the fashionable elite, winter was also a season of display. To host an evening gathering during the colder months was to demonstrate both hospitality and prosperity. Guests arrived cloaked against the cold, but within minutes, coats were shed, gloves set aside, and the glow of firelight restored comfort. Conversations hummed, glasses clinked, and the harshness of the season seemed to vanish behind layers of civility and elegance. Charity, too, played a role in the life of the wealthy during winter. Driven by genuine concern, social obligation, or a mixture of both, some families contributed to relief societies, funded soup kitchens, or distributed blankets to the poor. Clergymen appealed for donations, and ladies organized charity bazaars, where the proceeds went to coal funds for the needy. Yet even as such efforts were made, the gulf between comfort and hardship remained vast, a reality impossible to ignore when one left the warmth of Belgravia and ventured eastward into the fog-bound alleys. Still, for those fortunate enough to live in houses filled with light and warmth, winter could inspire a kind of romance. Snow on the rooftops gave the city a fairy tale sheen, and candlelit evenings seemed all the more enchanting against the darkness outside. The crackle of a fire, the scent of evergreens brought indoors, the sparkle of glassware in the lamplight. These details created an atmosphere where the season felt less like an adversary and more like an invitation to intimacy. And so, while London as a whole groaned beneath the weight of winter, its wealthy residents often experienced the season differently. For them, cold was something to be kept outside, at bay, beyond the curtains and doors. Inside, warmth reigned, warmth of fire, warmth of company, warmth of luxury. If hardship was the theme of winter in the East End, then comfort, carefully maintained and artfully displayed, was its counterpart in the West. As we leave this home, stepping once more into the chill of the night, the sharpness of the air reminds us that comfort was never universal. For every blazing hearth, there were dozens of darkened grates. For every glittering chandelier, 100 smoky candles. London was a city of dual winters, one endured, one enjoyed. And both were woven inseparably into the fabric of the Victorian season. If the parlours of the wealthy glowed with steady warmth, the streets of London told a different story. Winter there was neither holy misery nor holy magic, but a restless mixture of both. For though the cold pressed hard, the city never stood still. Work continued, trade persisted, and markets, always the beating heart of London's neighbourhoods, adapted themselves to the season in ways both practical and picturesque. Let us take a walk together through one such market. Imagine the air sharp with frost, your breath visible in small clouds as you pass through a narrow street lined with stalls. Canvas awnings sag beneath the weight of snow, and lanterns swing gently, their light casting wavering patterns on the cobblestones. The ground beneath your feet is slick with a mixture of ice and sawdust, scattered by vendors to keep the worst of the slipperiness at bay. The market is alive with sound. The calls of hawkers rise above the muffled noises of the city, voices advertising roasted chestnuts, hot pies, ribbons, and gingerbread. A boy with red cheeks tends a brazier, its coals glowing brightly as he scoops steaming chestnuts into little paper cones. A woman ladles hot eel stew into chipped bowls, the broth sending up fragrant clouds that briefly cut through the biting cold. Hunger and cold sharpen appetites, and few pass by without pausing for at least a mouthful of warmth. Children cluster around the sweet stalls, noses pressed close to trays of toffee, boiled sugar sticks, and gingerbread men with currant eyes. Pennies change hands, sticky fingers clutch their prizes, and for a moment the grimness of winter is softened by delight. Street musicians, bundled against the chill, play fiddles or squeeze accordions, their tunes lending a festive air. Coins clink into their hats as shoppers hurry past. The goods on offer reflect the season. Root vegetables lie in neat heaps: carrots, turnips, and potatoes, their earthy smell mingling with the sharper scent of fish, laid out on slabs of ice. Poultry hangs in rows, their feathers still clinging in places, while butchers call attention to cuts of beef and pork, ready for roasting. Sellers of clothing do brisk trade in scarves, gloves, and patched coats, calling out the warmth their wares can bring against the bitter wind. Everywhere, the cold is present. Vendors stamp their feet and blow into their hands, their voices hoarse from hours in the damp air. Customers linger only as long as needed, clutching parcels close as they hurry away. Yet despite the hardship, there is also vitality here, a sense of community that thrives even in the hardest months. The market, with its bustle and its bargains, offers both sustenance and connection. Beyond the stalls, street life carries on. Omnibuses rattle past, their passengers bundled tightly in cloaks and shawls. Chab horses snort clouds of steam as they wait in the cold, stamping hooves to keep the blood moving. Newsboys shout headlines, their voices carrying above the clatter, while ragged flower sellers hold out wilting blooms, hoping for a coin or two. Beggars crouch in doorways, bowls extended, their figures half lost in the fog. Street lighting in winter was unreliable, and so the nights came early. By late afternoon, lamps sputtered to life, their glow hazy in the mist. The fog, thickened by smoke from countless chimneys, could make even familiar streets feel uncanny. Yet people pressed on, guided by instinct, by the cries of vendors, by the warmth of fires that dotted the market scene. For children of the poor, winter street life was often a matter of survival. They scurried barefoot or in shoes worn through, offering matches, sweeping crossings, or carrying parcels for a penny. Some took to petty theft, slipping through crowds to snatch coins or food. Yet even among them, there was resiliency, games played on icy patches of street, songs sung in shrill voices for the hope of a coin, laughter that rang oddly bright in the frosty air. At Christmas, the markets grew especially lively. Holly and ivy were sold in bundles, their green leaves vivid against the grey streets. Bakers displayed plum puddings in their windows, dusted with flour like snow. Butchers hung geese and turkeys in neat rows, while toy sellers laid out wooden soldiers, dolls, and tin whistles. Even those with little to spend wandered among the stalls, drinking in the colors, the smells, the promise of a feast beyond reach. The rhythm of winter street life carried into the night. Some found their way to public houses, where warmth, ale, and company softened the edge of the season. Others trudged homeward with parcels, their faces half hidden by scarves. The poorest sought shelter where they could, under bridges, in workhouses, or in the shadowed corners of markets after the last stalls were packed away. And yet, if you pause here with me in the middle of it all, the smoke rising, the lanterns glowing faintly, the voices rising and falling, you may sense something beyond hardship. There is an energy, a stubborn persistence, a refusal to let winter still the city's pulse. For every icy blast, there is a brazier's glow, for every empty hand, the faint hope of a penny earned. This, too, was Victorian London in winter, a place where streets shivered but never fell silent, where the cold bit hard, but was answered with warmth in small, fleeting doses. Markets and street life, with all their mingled hardship and cheer, gave the season its texture. They were reminders that even in the bitterest months, London was never only a city of suffering, nor only a city of splendor, but always both at once. London was, even in the 19th century, a city of movement. Goods arrived by ship, trains thundered into great stations, and people flowed ceaselessly along streets and bridges. Yet when winter struck, the very act of moving from one place to another became fraught with difficulty. Snow and ice transformed familiar thoroughfares into treacherous landscapes, and transport, so vital to the city's lifeblood, slowed, faltered, and sometimes came to a halt. Picture, if you will, a January morning after a night of heavy snowfall. The city lies muffled in white, its rooftops softened, its cobbled streets hidden beneath uneven drifts. Carriage wheels, meant for firm ground, sink and skid in the slush. Horses, their coats dusted with frost, struggle for footing, hooves slipping as they strain against harnesses. The sound of iron shoes striking ice echoes sharply in the cold air. Omnibuses, those lumbering double-decked vehicles, continue their routes but at a crawl. Passengers climb aboard cautiously, clutching handrails slick with frost. Inside, the air is close with damp wool and steaming breath, while outside, the driver and conductor endure the biting wind with little more than scarves and gloves. Delays are constant. A journey that might take half an hour in fair weather stretches to twice that, or more. Yet Londoners, resilient and resigned, wait patiently, stamping their feet against the cold, grateful for any conveyance that still moves. Cabs, too, remained in service, though drivers cursed the weather under their breath. Their small, two-wheeled hansoms and larger four-wheeled growlers were difficult enough to steer in normal conditions. In snow and fog, they became precarious indeed. More than one driver lost control on icy slopes, sending horse and vehicle sliding dangerously before regaining balance. Accidents were common. Carriages colliding at corners, wheels breaking against hidden curbstones, or horses falling and unable to rise. Still, the demand for cabs never lessened, particularly from those wealthy enough to avoid trudging through the streets themselves. For pedestrians, the dangers were no fewer. Crossing sweepers, who normally earned pennies by clearing paths of mud, found their services doubly necessary in winter. With brooms and shovels, they scraped snow from crossings, revealing patches of slippery stone beneath. Yet even with their efforts, many a Londoner lost footing, tumbling into the slush while others hurried past. The city's pavements, never designed for such weather, became as perilous as the roadways. Railways, by contrast, offered a swifter if sometimes unreliable alternative. London's great termini, Paddington, Euston, King's Cross, and others, bustled with travellers seeking escape from the city's fog and frost. But snow-clogged tracks, switches froze, and engines struggled to keep time. A blizzard could strand passengers for hours, their breath fogging the chilled glass of waiting rooms, their patience tested by the muffled announcements of delays. Still, the railways were a marvel compared to older modes of travel, and even in winter, they carried goods and people in quantities the roads could never manage. Along the Thames, river transport also suffered. Ice rarely froze the water solid in the Victorian decades, but frost rimed the banks and fog thickened above the current. Watermen rowed cautiously, their oars dipping into dark water hidden beneath mist. Steam tugs whistled mournfully, their calls swallowed by the fog. Bridges loomed suddenly out of whiteness, their stone arches dripping with icicles. Though the river remained open, it was never free of hazard, especially on nights when fog and frost combined to make navigation nearly blind. And yet, for all the hardship, there was a peculiar beauty to London transport in winter. A line of carriages moving slowly through a snowy street seemed almost a procession, their lamps glowing like amber beads against the darkness. Horses with breath steaming in the air became noble, ghostly figures, straining steadily against the cold. Even the inconveniences, when recalled later from the warmth of a fireside, took on the shape of anecdotes. The omnibus that slid sideways into a drift, the cabman who vanished into the fog, only to reappear triumphant an hour later, his passenger still aboard. The city adapted where it could. Sand was sometimes scattered on particularly icy stretches, though not nearly enough. Policemen directed traffic more vigorously in fog, their lanterns swinging in arcs of light. Workmen cleared snow with shovels, piling it high at corners where it froze into miniature cliffs until thaw came. None of it was sufficient to restore ease, but it was enough to keep London moving, however haltingly, through the worst of the weather. For those on urgent errands, a merchant delivering goods, a doctor answering a night call, a family hurrying to a railway station. These struggles were serious matters. Yet for others, winter transport was part of the season's experience, endured with the same stoicism as cold rooms and smoky skies. To complain was natural. To carry on despite complaint was essential. And so London did carry on. Omnibuses rolled, cabs rattled, trains departed, and ships steamed along the river. Snow and ice slowed but never wholly silenced the city. Winter, however brutal, was never enough to still its endless movement. As we step aside from the crowded road and watch the carriages pass, the flicker of lanterns and the crunch of hooves fading into distance, we are reminded once again of the resilience that defined Victorian London. Movement, halting but steady, was the city's heartbeat, even in the coldest months. Winter in London always carried its share of inconveniences, but there were times when the season became something more. Something memorable, oppressive, and even legendary. Of all the winters spoken of in hushed recollection, the fogs of 1879 held a special place. They were not the first of their kind, nor would they be the last, but they seemed to descend with a weight and persistence that gave them a lasting hold on the city's memory. Fog was no stranger to London. The mingling of damp air from the Thames, with smoke from countless chimneys, had long produced those thick, yellowish mists that curled through streets and clung to windows. But in the closing weeks of 1879, the fogs grew darker and denser, until the city was shrouded in a gloom that daylight could scarcely penetrate. Imagine stepping outside on such a morning. The air is thick, acrid, and faintly choking. Even a few steps ahead, outlines blur and fade. The familiar shape of a lamppost becomes ghostly, its flame little more than a faint blur of orange. Buildings vanish into obscurity. Streets you have walked 100 times seem suddenly unfamiliar. Each sound, the clip of hooves, the cry of a newsboy, the call of a cabman, is muffled, arriving from no clear direction. The fog was not merely inconvenient, it was dangerous. Traffic slowed to a crawl, with drivers calling out to one another to avoid collisions. Horses stumbled on unseen obstacles, their snorts lost in the thick air. Omnibuses crept forward cautiously, their lamps doing little to cut the murk. Pedestrians groped their way along walls, hands outstretched to keep from straying into the road. Accidents were common. Carts overturned, carriages collided, and more than one unfortunate person wandered too close to the river's edge. Commerce, too, suffered. Shops opened late, their interiors dim despite the lamps lit within. At the great railway stations, trains stood idle or departed hours behind schedule, for signals could not be seen through the haze. Ships on the Thames lay at anchor, their whistles sounding mournfully, waiting for the air to clear enough to move. The very lifelines of the city, its roads, rails, and river, seemed suspended in a perpetual pause. The fog seeped indoors as well. Rooms grew dim in the middle of the day, curtains drawn back to no avail. Soot settled on furniture, a fine black dust that clung to every surface. Fires, instead of dispelling the gloom, only added to it, their smoke mingling with the mists that pressed through cracks and crevices. The air was heavy, and breathing it left throats raw, lungs aching. For those already ill, the fog was more than an annoyance, it was a menace. Newspapers of the time described the event with a mixture of awe and exasperation. They spoke of a city swallowed whole, of business nearly suspended, of accidents too numerous to tally. Some papers hinted at the romance of it, the strange beauty of lamps glowing faintly in a world of shadows, while others dwelt on the grim statistics of disruption and death. Both were true. The fog was at once atmospheric and oppressive, haunting and hazardous. Ordinary Londoners, for their part, endured as best they could. Children found a kind of eerie excitement in venturing into streets where the world seemed reduced to a circle of a few yards. Adults, less enchanted, muttered complaints while pressing forward on errands that could not wait. Cabmen charged higher fares for journeys that took twice the usual time. Crossing sweepers, nearly invisible in the gloom, banged their brooms against the stones to announce their presence. Life continued, haltingly, within a city turned inward by its own breath. And yet, for all its disruption, there was a strange stillness to the fog that lingers in descriptions from the time. Sounds were dampened, movements slowed, and even the bustling heart of London seemed subdued. It was as if the city, for once, had been wrapped in silence, compelled to pause. For some, that quietude was unsettling, a reminder of vulnerability. For others, it was oddly calming, a moment of enforced rest in a place that seldom stopped. By the time the fogs of 1879 began to lift, Londoners were wary of them. The return of clearer air, even if cold and biting, was greeted almost with relief. Shops resumed their brisk trade, trains ran nearer to schedule, and the river stirred again with motion. Yet the memory of those weeks lingered, a time when the great city was all but brought to a standstill, not by snow or ice, but by its own mingled smoke and mist. In later years, writers would recall the Great Fog with a mixture of dread and fascination. It became part of the mythology of Victorian winters, one of those episodes that seemed to capture both the uniqueness of the city and the harshness of its season. For our purposes, as we rest here in thought, it serves as another reminder of the peculiar trials of winter in Victorian London. Not all hardship came from freezing winds or falling snow. Sometimes it came from the very air itself, thickened into something both tangible and inescapable. If the fogs and frosts of a Victorian winter were troublesome for those of means, they were devastating for the poor. Nowhere was this more evident than in the workhouses. Those grim institutions meant to provide shelter and sustenance for the destitute, yet which often delivered little more than survival at its barest margin. The workhouse system had been reformed in 1834 under the New Poor Law, with the intent of discouraging dependence on charity. Relief, it was believed, should be less eligible than the lowest form of labor, so that only the truly desperate would submit to it. The result was a network of buildings, scattered across London and beyond, each a place where the poor could find a roof and food, but at a price. The surrender of freedom, dignity, and often health. Winter brought the workhouses into their harshest focus. The cold pressed hardest on those who had no means of heating their homes, or indeed no homes at all. Thin walls, broken windows, and unheated garrets were poor defenses against a January gale. For those without steady wages, the choice was stark: freeze in the streets or submit to the workhouse gates. And so, with each cold snap, numbers swelled, the great doors opening reluctantly to admit the shivering masses. Inside, the reality was far from comforting. Men and women were separated, families divided. Children were sent to their own wards, where schooling was meager and discipline strict. Meals were basic bread, gruel, perhaps a thin stew. In winter, these rations seemed especially meager, insufficient to ward off the chill that crept into bones. Fires were few, kept small to conserve coal. Blankets were thin, bedding hard. To survive was possible, but to thrive was out of the question. For many inmates, labor was required in return for this meager sustenance. Tasks varied: breaking stones, picking oakum, teasing apart old ropes into fibers, or scrubbing laundry in icy water. Such work was meant as both occupation and deterrent, proof that life inside was not to be chosen lightly. In winter, these labors were doubly harsh. Hands cracked and bled in the cold. Feet ached from standing long hours on frozen floors. Yet the alternative, exposure in the streets, was worse. The workhouses also bore the weight of disease, which winter aggravated. Crowded rooms and weakened bodies made fertile ground for illness. Coughs echoed through the wards, fever spread quickly, and the damp air seemed to cling to lungs. For the elderly, especially, the season was perilous. Records tell of spikes in mortality each winter, the cold acting as a silent reaper within walls meant to shield. Outside, attitudes toward the poor remained mixed. Some saw the workhouses as necessary bulwarks against idleness, others as cruel prisons that punished poverty rather than relieved it. In winter, charitable societies sometimes tried to bridge the gap. Soup kitchens were established, distributing hot broth to those who could not or would not face the workhouse. Donations of blankets and coal were collected, though never enough to meet the demand. Still, the workhouse loomed large as the default refuge for thousands, whether by choice or compulsion. The experience of entering one on a bitter night was etched into many memories. Picture a mother, shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, leading two wary children to the gate. A clerk notes their names, then separates them. Mother one way, children another. Tears are shed, yet there is no choice. Within hours, they are washed, given uniforms, and folded into the great machinery of institutional life. Their bellies may be filled with bread, their heads laid on straw, but warmth and comfort remain distant dreams. Not all Londoners could bring themselves to cross that threshold. Some chose instead the precarious life of casual wards, where a bed might be purchased for a penny in common lodging houses, or a night spent huddled under bridges, wrapped in newspapers against the cold. Such choices led many to early graves, yet for some, even this seemed preferable to the regimented austerity of the workhouse. Writers of the era did not ignore these conditions. Charles Dickens, though he wrote earlier in the century, had etched the cruelty of the system into public imagination with his depictions of Oliver Twist and other unfortunate souls. Later reformers and journalists continued to shine light on the plight of the poor, particularly in winter. Their words, though softened by the passage of time, still carry the chill of those nights when hunger gnawed and frost bit deep. For us, considering these scenes from a warm distance, the workhouse remains one of the most haunting symbols of Victorian winter. It speaks of a society grappling with poverty on a vast scale, uncertain how to balance compassion with discipline, fearful of encouraging dependence, yet confronted with suffering too widespread to ignore. And so, amid the enchanting images of frost fairs and skating ponds, we must also hold in mind the dimly lit wards of the workhouses, where countless Londoners endured the season not with delight, but with resignation. Their winters were not softened by festivity, but endured through necessity, day after day, until the first signs of spring brought some measure of relief. It is in this juxtaposition, merriment for some, hardship for many, that the full portrait of Victorian winter takes shape. Among all who felt the cruel edge of a Victorian winter, none were more vulnerable than the children who roamed the streets of London. The city swarmed with them, ragged, hungry, and often barefoot, living embodiments of poverty made visible. These young souls, sometimes called street Arabs, by contemporaries were at once pitied, feared, and overlooked. On a January evening, the plight of such a child might unfold like this: a thin figure crouched against the lee of a stone wall, coat threadbare, breath puffing in little white clouds. The cobbles beneath are slick with frost, offering no comfort. Around him, London bustles on, but he is invisible to most, a shadow among many, one more waif lost in the press of humanity. For many of these children, the streets were home, orphaned by disease, abandoned by parents unable to feed them, or simply driven out by violence. They found themselves cast into the city's currents. Some survived by sweeping crossings for pennies, others by selling matches or cheap flowers. A lucky few might shine boots, though competition was fierce. And in winter, even these fragile occupations dwindled, for few cared to pause in a snow-laden street to buy matches, and fewer still risked polished shoes in the slush. The result was hunger, sharp, unrelenting, gnawing hunger that accompanied cold in a grim partnership. Contemporary reports describe children fainting from lack of food, or clustering around grates and bakery doors to catch even a wisp of warmth or smell of bread. It is little wonder that petty theft became common. a crust taken from a cart, a coal pinched from a passing load. These were not luxuries but survival. Charitable institutions tried to intervene. Ragged schools offered rudimentary education and a meal. Refuges provided temporary shelter. Yet the demand far outstripped the supply. Thousands of children remained adrift, slipping between the cracks of well-meaning efforts. Winter exposed these cracks most sharply, for when nights fell below freezing, even the hardiest little body could not endure long without some kind of refuge. Literature of the period often drew upon these realities. Dickens, again, had immortalized the archetype of the shivering child. Though his novels predated the harshest decades of Victorian industrial life. Later writers and reformers carried the theme forward, painting vivid pictures of boys huddled under arches, girls begging with frost-bitten fingers. These images were not exaggerations, they were observations. Some children, desperate for warmth, would commit petty crimes with the hope of being arrested. A night in a police cell, though grim, offered walls, blankets, and perhaps bread. Magistrates knew this pattern well, though few solutions presented themselves. To be sent to a reformatory or industrial school might mean years of discipline. Yet for the child, it meant safety and meals. Luxuries otherwise uncertain. One striking account from the 1860s describes a group of boys gathering near the frozen Thames, using discarded tea trays to slide down snowy embankments. For a brief hour, laughter echoed where hunger usually ruled. But soon enough, the game ended. The cold drove them to find some hidden corner to pass the night. That fleeting joy, shining like frost in lamplight, only underscored the harshness of the world awaiting them. Orphanages provided more stability, though places were limited. Institutions such as Dr. Barnardo's homes became lifelines for some, pulling children from the streets into structured, if austere, environments. Even there, winters were lean. Coal supplies ran low, bedding was thin, and meals seldom abundant. Yet compared to the exposure of the streets, such homes were havens. Many a child, half frozen and starving, must have looked upon their gates with mingled fear and desperate hope. Winter shaped childhood in profound ways. For middle-class families, it brought skating parties, Christmas festivities, and evenings by the hearth. For the poor, it carved resilience into tender years, forcing ingenuity and endurance where play might otherwise have reigned. The sound of children's laughter in the snow was not absent from Victorian London, but it was unevenly distributed, echoing most clearly in squares and parks, where privilege softened the season. As we reflect on these children of the frost, it is tempting to let the image grow too bleak, to imagine only endless suffering. Yet within those hardships lived sparks of resilience. A shared crust, a bit of laughter in the cold, a makeshift game with whatever scraps were at hand. These moments of warmth, however small, gave texture to otherwise grey lives. The children were not merely victims of winter, they were survivors of it, carrying scars, but also stories. And so, in picturing Victorian winters, let us not forget the smallest Londoners, their breath rising in white clouds as they darted through fog and snow. Their struggles remind us that history is not only the tale of great events or noble houses, but also of fragile bodies, enduring cold nights with courage born of necessity. In their resilience, there is something quietly luminous, like the faint glow of a gas lamp in the fog. Not bright enough to dispel the darkness, but steady enough to hold it at bay. Few images of old London winters capture the imagination quite like that of the frozen Thames. The mighty river, normally flowing dark and restless, would on rare occasions succumb to the grip of a bitter season, its surface turning to a vast, glittering plain of ice. Upon this unlikely stage, Londoners gathered in centuries past to celebrate a festival that was equal parts carnival and curiosity, the Frost Fair. The phenomenon was made possible by two factors: the colder climate of the Little Ice Age and the slower currents of the Thames before the construction of modern embankments. Ice would form along the banks, spread, and eventually join across the channel. When the river lay firm enough to bear weight, it became not just a thoroughfare but a playground, lined with stalls and teeming with life. By the time Victoria came to the throne, such events were already fading into memory. The last great frost fair occurred in the winter of 1813-14, when the river froze solid for several weeks. Yet the echoes of that final extravaganza lingered in popular lore throughout the 19th century, and winter after winter, Londoners looked back on it with mingled nostalgia and awe. Contemporary accounts describe an extraordinary scene. From Blackfriars to London Bridge, the river became a broad avenue, dubbed the City Road. Stalls sprang up, offering roasted meats, hot gin, and gingerbread. Printers carried presses onto the ice, selling souvenir cards boldly proclaiming they had been printed on the Thames. Oxen were roasted whole, filling the air with savory smoke. Musicians played, acrobats performed, and children squealed with delight as they skated or slid across the frozen surface. Among the fair's more remarkable spectacles was the parade of an elephant across the river near Blackfriars Bridge. A feat that astonished onlookers and seemed to prove the ice's strength beyond doubt. For weeks, the frozen Thames became London's grandest thoroughfare, hosting both noblemen and paupers, each eager to take part in what seemed a lifetime wonder. Yet the fair was not without risk. As the thaw began, cracks appeared, and more than one unwary reveller found himself plunged into icy waters. Boats patrolled the edges to pluck out the unfortunate, though not all were saved. Still, the memory of that season remained gilded in the public imagination, a triumph of festivity over frost. After 1814, the river never again froze so completely. Changes in climate brought milder winters, and engineering projects altered the Thames's flow, making such deep freezes improbable. By the Victorian era, the frost fairs were already legends, recounted by older generations to wide-eyed listeners. Newspapers occasionally printed retrospectives, and woodcuts of bustling ice streets adorned keepsake books. The notion of a frozen river, once familiar, became almost fantastical, a relic of an earlier, harsher age. Still, the fascination with ice did not disappear. Though the Thames no longer served as a carnival ground, artificial ice rinks began to appear in London during the later decades of the century. These offered a controlled echo of the old fairs: skating, socializing, and novelty, though without the risk of tumbling through a fissure in the river. Society ladies and gentlemen donned their finest coats to glide beneath glass roofs, sipping chilled refreshments imported from abroad. In their own way, these new amusements carried forward the city's long romance with winter frost. For ordinary Londoners, however, the memory of the frost fairs was tinged with wistfulness. To imagine the river transformed from a dark, flowing barrier into a place of gathering and joy was to glimpse a London both strange and familiar. It was a reminder that even the harshest winters could hold moments of beauty and delight, that the city itself could be reshaped by the hand of nature into something magical. And so, as the fogs rolled in and the streets grew slick with ice, Victorians might look upon the river and wonder, would it ever freeze again? Each cold snap stirred faint hope. Each crust of ice along the banks was watched with curiosity. But the age of frost fairs had passed, leaving behind only stories, prints, and the gleam of memory. For us, resting in imagination, the thought of wandering among those stalls on the frozen Thames carries a peculiar comfort. The crackle of frost beneath boots, the glow of fires against the night, the hum of voices carried across a river turned to glass, all conjure an atmosphere both soothing and surreal. It is a reminder that history, even in its coldest moments, could sparkle with warmth, laughter, and community. The frozen Thames, though long gone, remains an enduring emblem of winter's dual nature in Victorian London. Harsh and beautiful, perilous and enchanting, a river turned fairground, a hardship turned into festivity. An image to carry with us as we drift further along our journey through the icy heart of that age. Though winter in Victorian London was often grim, it was also a season of merriment for those who had the means to enjoy it. Beyond the hardships of fog and frost, the city also hummed with entertainments designed to bring light and laughter into dark months. For the well-to-do, winter was a time of parties, concerts, and skating parties, diversions that sparkled like frost on lamplight. One of the most fashionable pursuits was ice skating. With the Thames no longer freezing, Londoners turned instead to ponds in the city's parks, and later, to artificial rinks. When the Serpentine in Hyde Park froze solid, it became a glittering scene. Gentlemen gliding with top hats perched jauntily, ladies bundled in fur muffs and cloaks, their cheeks pink from the chill. Skating was more than exercise. It was a social stage, a place to be seen and admired. Illustrated newspapers delighted in sketches of the elegant figures tracing circles on the ice. Private gatherings, too, flourished in the colder months. The Victorian middle and upper classes embraced the drawing room as the heart of social life. With curtains drawn against the fog and fires burning bright, parlours became theatres of amusement. Guests were entertained with music, recitations, and parlour games. Charades, shadow plays, and riddles occupied many a long evening. For those musically inclined, the piano provided endless possibilities, from gentle ballads to lively dances. Winter also brought the theatre into prominence. Audiences packed into London's many playhouses to escape the chill and delight in performances ranging from Shakespeare to the latest melodramas. The flicker of gaslight on stage, the swell of orchestra music, the murmur of a crowded house, all lent warmth to evenings otherwise wrapped in frost. Pantomimes, in particular, were beloved winter fare, their blend of comedy, spectacle, and audience participation appealing across social classes. The holiday season gave an added sparkle. Christmas, revitalized in the Victorian era by royal example and popular writers, became a centerpiece of winter life. Families gathered around evergreen trees, adorned with candles and ornaments, exchanged gifts, and sang carols. Children thrilled to the sight of plum puddings, carried alight with brandy flames, while adults lingered over mulled wine and mince pies. These traditions, still familiar today, carried a particular glow in the gaslit rooms of Victorian London, offering warmth against the chill outside. For society's elite, winter also meant the season of balls and assemblies. Lavish affairs filled the social calendar, with invitations eagerly sought and fashion on dazzling display. Ballrooms were festooned with garlands, mirrors reflected the glitter of chandeliers, and orchestras played until the early hours as couples whirled across polished floors. Beyond mere amusement, these gatherings served as crucial arenas of connection, places to secure friendships, forge alliances, and perhaps arrange advantageous marriages. Nor was the appetite for spectacle confined to interiors. Outdoor entertainments flourished too. Firework displays sometimes illuminated winter skies, their sparks reflected in icy puddles. Torchlit processions, skating races, and sleigh rides added drama to the season. Even the fog, so often cursed, could lend a mysterious air to nighttime gatherings, softening edges and turning the familiar into the dreamlike. Literature and reading, always central to Victorian life, gained special prominence in winter. Long evenings by the hearth were filled with serialized novels, newspapers, and poetry. Families might gather as one member read aloud, voices carrying over the crackle of the fire. The works of Dickens, Thackeray, and Trollope found eager audiences in such settings, their stories woven into the fabric of winter memory. The printed word became both entertainment and escape, offering journeys far from the cold streets outside. Importantly, winter entertainments were not confined only to the wealthy. Public houses and music halls offered cheer to working class Londoners, with songs, comedy acts, and cheap suppers. Markets bustled with seasonal treats, gingerbread stalls glistened with sugar, and traveling showmen brought marvels of magic lantern slides or mechanical toys. While not as grand as the ballrooms of Mayfair, these gatherings provided warmth, community, and joy in their own measure. In this blend of delights, we glimpse another face of Victorian winter. Not the hardship of tenement rooms or the menace of fog, but the sparkle of companionship, the glow of festivity. Life, even amid chill and struggle, found ways to celebrate. Perhaps this was winter's greatest gift, its power to draw people together, to make firelight and music shine all the brighter against the darkness outside. As we imagine these scenes, skaters tracing loops on frozen ponds, children laughing at a pantomime, families gathered by lamplight around a piano, we sense the resilience of joy. Winter may have been brutal, but it was also, for many, beautiful. The cold sharpened the appetite for warmth, and in seeking it, Victorians created traditions and entertainments, whose echoes still glimmer faintly in our own winters today. If the drawing rooms of Victorian London rang with music and laughter in winter, the streets told a harsher story. For countless men, women, and children who depended on outdoor trade for survival, the season brought not cheer but hardship. Hawkers, costermongers, and street sellers of every kind braved the bitter air daily, their livelihoods tied to the open pavements, no matter the weather. The costermonger, the itinerant vendor of fruit, vegetables, and other goods, was a familiar figure in London life. With barrows laden high, they called out their wares in distinctive cries, voices carrying through fog and frost. Winter, however, was cruel to their trade. Frost spoiled fresh produce, snow made wheels stick fast in slush, and biting winds kept customers indoors. A day's taking shrank, even as the cost of coal and bread rose. Many wrapped themselves in patched coats, fingers red and raw from cold, as they pushed carts along streets muffled in ice. Other hawkers sold matches, bollards, pins, or cheap trinkets. Children, in particular, were pressed into this work, their small voices piping weakly against the wind. Some carried baskets of watercress, bundled in shawls that barely shielded them, hoping to sell a few bunches before the frost turned their stock to limp ruin. Accounts from social investigators like Henry Mayhew capture the desperation of these young sellers, who endured long hours on the street for a few pennies reward. Hot food vendors fared slightly better, for winter sharpened appetites for warmth. Sellers of roasted chestnuts, baked potatoes, and hot eels became welcome figures in the season, their braziers glowing red in the mist. Crowds gathered gratefully around them, both to purchase and to borrow a moment's heat. The smell of roasting chestnuts drifting through the fog was one of winter's small consolations, a comfort amid hardship. Yet even these vendors struggled when snowstorms kept customers away, or when coal prices cut into meager profits. Newsboys were another hardy presence, shouting headlines through the murk of winter mornings. Fog deadened their voices, and numb fingers struggled to hold the ink-stained sheets. Many rose before dawn, tramping across slick pavements with stacks of papers under their arms. Their livelihood depended on speed and stamina, both cruelly tested by sleet and frost. Markets, too, bore the brunt of the season. Covent Garden, Billingsgate, and Smithfield were all open, air to a large degree, and traders stood shivering beside stalls laden with fish, meat, or produce. Icy winds cut through their layers, while frost stiffened ropes and numbed hands. Yet the business of feeding the city could not pause for weather. Porters carried heavy loads across frozen cobbles, their breath rising in clouds, while buyers haggled briskly to escape the cold. For many outdoor workers, winter meant illness, exposure to damp and chill bred coughs and fevers, and few could afford a doctor's care. Frostbite, chilblains, and bronchitis were common companions. Still, necessity forced them out each morning, for hunger pressed harder than the cold. Those who failed to earn enough might spend nights in lodging houses or even on the streets, their condition deteriorating further with each passing week of frost. Yet there was resilience, too. The ingenuity of street traders often shone brightest in winter. Some turned to selling seasonal goods, sprigs of holly and ivy at Christmas, penny toys for children, or cheap paper decorations for festive rooms. Others offered hot drinks, coffee or cocoa ladled from steaming cans, their warmth prized by wary passers-by. Even in hardship, London's streets buzzed with enterprise, proof of the determination to wrest survival from the season. The contrast between the city's social classes was never sharper than in these months. While skating parties twirled in Hyde Park and drawing rooms glowed with firelight, thousands toiled outside for pennies, their struggles largely unseen by those within. Yet, in another sense, they were part of the same winter tapestry. The hawker's cry mingled with the clatter of carriages, the glow of a potato brazier flickered in the same fog that dimmed a gentleman's lantern. All were bound together by the shared cold, though not by the same comforts. As we picture these trades, there is a kind of melancholy poetry in their endurance. The chestnut seller warming hands over coals, the costermonger pushing a barrow through rutted snow, the watercress girl hurrying with her basket before frost spoils her wares. Each represents not merely hardship but tenacity. They remind us that winter in Victorian London was not only about suffering, nor only about festivity, but about the countless small struggles and triumphs of daily life. For us, lying back in imagination, the cries of street sellers fade gently into the distance, softened by fog and time. They are voices from another age, yet still they echo faintly, a testament to human endurance in the face of winter's bite. Of all the places where the harshness of Victorian winters was most keenly felt, few rivaled the workhouse. Established under the poor law to provide relief for the destitute, these institutions became symbols of both refuge and punishment. In winter, when hunger deepened and frost stiffened the streets, their gates drew in those who could endure no more outside. Yet stepping within was seldom a cause for comfort. The workhouse promised shelter, food, and warmth of a sort, but always at a price. Families who sought relief were separated at the door, husbands, wives, and children consigned to different wards, often with little chance to see one another. The philosophy behind this system was stark. Age should never appear attractive, lest it encourage idleness. Thus, even in the coldest months, admission to the workhouse was designed to be deterrent rather than deliverance. Winter swelled the numbers. With street trades slowed by frost, employment scarce, and coal prices rising beyond reach, the destitute found few alternatives. Reports from the mid-19th century describe wards filled beyond capacity, beds crammed close, and staff struggling to manage the influx. Children, thinly clad, were brought in shivering, their cheeks pinched blue by the cold. Old men and women, too weak to labor, huddled together for what warmth they could find. Conditions inside were austere. Meals were plain to the point of monotony: thin porridge in the morning, bread and cheese at midday, a bowl of gruel or broth in the evening. In theory, rations provided sustenance. In practice, they left many perpetually hungry. Fires burned low, for fuel was rationed. Stone walls exhaled damp, and drafts seeped through ill-fitted windows. The cold, though less biting than outside, was never banished entirely. Work was demanded in exchange for board. Men broke stones, picked oakum, or labored at menial tasks. Women sewed, laundered, or scrubbed floors. These duties continued through the winter months, though numb fingers and aching joints made them ever more punishing. For children, schooling was offered alongside work, yet their lessons were often overshadowed by the chill of unheated classrooms. Illness thrived in such conditions. Winter brought outbreaks of influenza, bronchitis, and pneumonia. With crowded dormitories and poor ventilation, contagion spread swiftly. Doctors were stretched thin, and medical supplies scarce. Mortality within workhouses rose noticeably in the coldest seasons, a grim testament to the fragility of those who entered. And yet, for many, the workhouse was preferable to the alternative of freezing on the streets. To have even a cot in a shared dormitory was more security than some had known for weeks. The gruel, however thin, was at least regular. Fires, though meagre, offered more heat than bare pavements. For the destitute, survival often outweighed dignity. Contemporary observers recorded the despair and resignation of inmates during these winter months. Henry Mayhew and Charles Dickens both gave voice to the stories of men and women driven to seek the poor man's prison, as the workhouse was often called. Their writings exposed the paradox of a system that sought to discourage dependency by making relief deliberately unpleasant, even when lives hung in the balance. Christmas in the workhouse acquired a particular notoriety. Newspapers occasionally reported on attempts to brighten the day with slightly larger meals, perhaps a slice of meat or a pudding, though such gestures only highlighted the bleakness of the ordinary fare. Hymns were sung, prayers recited, but the season of goodwill was muted within walls built to deter. Outside, families gathered around fires. Inside, mothers and children remained divided, voices carrying faintly through barred corridors. The architecture of the buildings themselves added to the chill. Designed with order and surveillance in mind, they favored bare stone, high ceilings, and barred windows. These features, effective in enforcing discipline, made the rooms echo with drafts. In winter, echoes of coughs and footsteps mingled with the rasp of wind through cracks, creating an atmosphere as cold in spirit as in temperature. For us, imagining a winter night in the workhouse is to step into a world of muted sounds and dim light. The shuffle of boots across stone floors, the clink of tin spoons against bowls, the muffled coughs from rows of beds, all fade into the background hum of a city's poorest gathered under one roof. Beyond those walls, the frost hardens the streets. Within, the cold lingers still, softened only slightly by thin blankets and thin meals. The workhouse in winter stands as one of the starkest reminders of Victorian society's contradictions. A city of immense wealth and progress that left many of its citizens to endure indignity as the price of survival. To close our eyes and wander through those corridors is to feel not just the chill of the air, but the weight of a system that made poverty itself a punishment. The winters of Victorian London were not only a test of endurance against the cold, but also a crucible for the body's frailties. At a time when medical science was still taking its uncertain steps toward modern understanding, illnesses that today might be dismissed as minor could swiftly become life-threatening. The chill of the season made lungs fragile, skin vulnerable, and immune systems wary, creating conditions ripe for disease. Coughs and colds, so ordinary now, were dreaded visitors in the 19th century. A lingering cough might signal the onset of bronchitis, pneumonia, or even tuberculosis, a disease that haunted London's overcrowded neighborhoods. Known grimly as consumption, tuberculosis thrived in damp, poorly ventilated lodgings where cold air seeped through cracks and families huddled together for warmth. Winter exacerbated its spread, as windows were closed tight against drafts, trapping both heat and infection. Influenza, too, struck with seasonal cruelty. Epidemics flared in particularly harsh winters, sweeping through the city with fevers, chills, and exhaustion. The medical community debated its causes, some believing it to be airborne, others attributing it to miasma, the foul air they thought carried disease. Though germ theory was gaining ground, by the latter half of the century, many physicians still clung to older notions, leaving treatments uncertain and often ineffective. Hospitals, though expanding in number, were ill prepared to meet the surge of patients that winter brought. Facilities like St. Bartholomew's or Guy's Hospital filled their wards with sufferers struggling for breath, while smaller infirmaries overflowed. The poorest often had no access to these institutions at all, relying instead on parish relief or charity. Doctors might visit homes in the rookeries, stepping into one-room dwellings where entire families lay coughing on straw pallets, yet their remedies seldom extended beyond rest, mustard plasters, or tinctures of laudanum. Cold-related ailments compounded the misery. Frostbite was a constant risk for those who lived and worked outdoors. Fingers, toes, and ears blackened in the chill, leaving permanent injury. Hypothermia, though the term was not yet widely used, claimed countless lives among the homeless and elderly. Coroners' reports from particularly bitter years list dozens found lifeless in alleys, stairwells, or beneath bridges, their bodies stiffened by the frost. Even those better off were not immune. Drafty houses, despite their grandeur, could be treacherous. Bedrooms with unheated fireplaces, icy corridors, and damp stone walls left residents shivering. Servants, often lodged in attic rooms or basements, endured especially cruel conditions, their health weakened by poor diets and long hours of work. Diaries from the era reveal endless notes of winter sickness, sore throats, chest infections, fevers that lingered far into spring. The remedies of the day, though offered in good faith, were a mixture of the practical and the peculiar. Hot poultices of bread or mustard were applied to the chest in hopes of drawing out congestion. Cod, liver oil, bitter and enduringly unpopular, was prescribed as a tonic for weak lungs. Bleeding and blistering, though waning in fashion, still lingered in some medical circles. Herbal syrups of horehound or licorice were sold in apothecaries, while patent medicines promised miraculous cures in ornate glass bottles. Public health reformers grew increasingly concerned as the toll of winter illnesses mounted. The sanitary revolution of the mid-century, spurred by figures like Edwin Chadwick, sought to address the root causes: damp housing, poor drainage, and inadequate ventilation. Efforts to improve sewer systems and regulate housing standards began to show results, but progress was slow, and many Londoners continued to live in conditions ripe for contagion. Charitable organizations stepped in where official measures faltered. Societies distributed blankets, coal, and nourishing soups to the poor in the cold months. Lady visitors from philanthropic groups made their rounds, checking on families in their parishes and bringing remedies or small comforts. Some hospitals opened special winter wards to accommodate the seasonal influx, though beds remained scarce. Yet, for all the hardship, stories of resilience abounded. Families nursed one another with what resources they had. Communities in the rookeries often shared fuel or food when illness struck. Even in the bleakest winters, neighbors carried soup to the sick, lit fires for those too weak to rise, and sat through the long nights with the dying. These small acts of solidarity softened the harsh outlines of a season otherwise marked by suffering. One can imagine, on a foggy January evening, the interior of a modest sick room, a single candle flickering, casting shadows on the peeling plaster walls, a child's rasping cough breaking the silence, a mother pressing a warm compress to her child's chest, while whispering prayers that spring might arrive before death did. Outside, the frost clings to the panes, and the world seems locked in stillness, but within, love persists against the cold. Looking back, it is clear that Victorian medicine, though limited, was in transition. The spread of germ theory, the gradual improvement of hospitals, and the rise of public health campaigns marked the beginnings of modern approaches. Yet in the winter months, progress was too slow to spare thousands from needless suffering. The season exposed the limits of knowledge and the vulnerability of bodies pressed by poverty and frost. To wander in thought through these wintry sick rooms is to glimpse both the fragility and the fortitude of Victorian London. The illnesses of the season carried away many, yet the endurance of those who survived, often with little more than determination and neighborly care, testifies to a resilience as enduring as the city itself. Among the many winters that left their mark on Victorian London, few stand out with such force as that of January 1881. Newspapers of the day carried vivid reports of a storm so sudden and so ferocious that it paralyzed the capital for days. It was not simply a matter of cold or fog. Familiar enough to Londoners, this was snow on a scale seldom seen in living memory. A blizzard that transformed the city into a frozen labyrinth. The snowfall began innocuously enough, with light flakes drifting down on a Sunday afternoon. By evening, the wind rose, and the flakes thickened into sheets. Streets that had still been navigable by foot and carriage just hours earlier grew impassable. Within a single night, drifts piled high against walls and doorways, in some places reaching the windowsills of ground floor rooms. Residents awoke to find their homes barricaded by nature itself. Travel, always vulnerable in harsh weather, ground to a standstill. Omnibuses stood idle, their wheels locked fast in snow that reached their axles. Trains fared little better, their engines struggling to plow through the drifts, many halting altogether on the tracks. Passengers, wrapped in whatever cloaks they had, waited in freezing compartments until relief could be organized. Letters and parcels, ordinarily the lifeblood of the capital, were delayed for days. The city's poor, already fragile, bore the brunt of the storm's fury. Casual workers who depended on daily wages found no employment in the snowbound streets. Costermongers, unable to wheel their barrows, saw their trade vanish. Beggars, who relied on the rhythm of pedestrian traffic, discovered the streets empty save for the muffled sound of boots crunching through powder. For many, the blizzard meant hunger added to cold. Even the better-off struggled with the disruption. In the West End, elegant houses lay wrapped in silence as their owners waited for deliveries of coal and food that could not arrive. Chimneys smoked faintly, but many fires burned low for lack of fuel. Servants ventured out to clear steps and pathways, their hands raw from the freezing air. Yet the snow fell faster than it could be removed. Coaches remained trapped in mews and carriage houses, their wheels buried. Accounts from the newspapers describe scenes at once chaotic and strangely beautiful. The domes and spires of the city emerged from the snow like ghostly silhouettes. The Thames, sluggish and half-frozen, bore ice floes downstream. Children, resilient as ever, turned the disaster into play, sliding on makeshift sleds down embankments and fashioning snowmen in squares. In St. Paul's churchyard, enterprising boys charged passers-by a penny to ride their borrowed tea trays down the towering drifts. Not all tales were so light-hearted. Coroners' records show a sharp rise in deaths during those frozen days. Some were victims of exposure, found collapsed in alleys or stairwells. Others perished in accidents, a carriage overturned in the snow, a laborer buried by a collapsing roof weighed down by ice, pedestrians struck blind by gusts of wind and stepping into the river. The snow, though enchanting, carried danger at every corner. Yet the storm also revealed the city's resilience. Neighbors banded together to dig out blocked streets. Churches opened their doors as makeshift shelters, offering warm broth to those in need. Volunteers organized soup kitchens, serving long queues of shivering families. Even the newspapers, while reporting the misery, spoke admiringly of the fortitude with which Londoners endured. One story from the Illustrated London News recounts a scene near the Strand. A group of men, waist deep in snow, working side by side to clear a path for a stranded omnibus. As they labored, laughter broke out, and a bystander remarked that the storm had at least made Londoners into neighbors. In hardship, a curious camaraderie often emerged. The blizzard lingered for 3 days before easing. When at last the skies cleared, the sun glinted off a city transformed into a glittering white expanse. Icicles hung from eaves like crystal daggers, and snowbanks rose in great frozen walls along the streets. Slowly, the rhythms of life returned. Carriages resumed their rounds, trains crept back on schedule, and merchants reopened their shops, though shortages of bread and coal continued for some time. In retrospect, the winter of 1881 was remembered not merely for its severity, but for its spectacle. Artists sketched the snowbound city, capturing domes and bridges under their frosty cloaks. Writers noted the eerie silence that had fallen over normally clamorous streets. For children who lived through it, the memory of snow tunnels and impromptu sledding hills lingered well into adulthood. Today, to picture that blizzard is to imagine London briefly transformed into another city entirely. The fog and grime of industry were momentarily veiled, replaced by the purity of snow, yet beneath the beauty lay hardship, hunger, cold, and the reminder of how vulnerable a great metropolis remained when nature chose to assert her power. The winter of 1881 stands, then, as both a caution and a marvel. It revealed the fragility of Victorian infrastructure and the peril of poverty in an unforgiving season. Yet it also left behind images of startling beauty. Spires gleaming in white, children laughing in the drifts, and neighbors discovering solidarity in the act of shoveling snow. A blizzard remembered not only for the suffering it caused, but for the way it etched itself into the collective memory of a city that endured. While the streets of Victorian London grew treacherous with snow, slush, and choking fogs, life indoors took on a more sociable and lively character. For all the hardships of winter, it was also a season of entertainment. Within the warm glow of gaslight, Londoners of every class sought refuge in diversions that banished, if only briefly, the cold and the gloom. For the wealthy, winter was the season of assemblies, balls, and soirees. Mansions in Belgravia or Mayfair glittered with chandeliers as orchestras played waltzes and quadrilles. Ladies in silk gowns swept across polished floors, their jewels catching the flicker of candlelight. Gentlemen in tails conversed in corners, glasses of champagne in hand, while servants discreetly replenished trays of delicacies. Outside, frost rimed the windows, but inside the air was warm with music, laughter, and the hum of conversation. The theatre, too, thrived in winter. Drury Lane, Covent Garden, and the Haymarket drew eager audiences seeking diversion from the chill. Gas lamps illuminated ornate auditoriums, their crimson curtains drawn back to reveal dramas, comedies, and spectacles of great extravagance. In pantomime season, children and adults alike laughed at slapstick routines, marveled at magical transformations, and shouted gleefully at stock characters. These performances, light-hearted and fanciful, offered a welcome escape from the weary grey of London's streets. Music halls provided a different kind of cheer. Popular among the working and middle classes, they were lively spaces where patrons could eat, drink, and enjoy variety acts under one roof. Comic singers, acrobats, dancers, and ventriloquists filled the stage, while audiences joined in refrains or clapped to the beat. Smoke from pipes mingled with the warmth of bodies, creating a haze that, while thick, felt far more convivial than the pea-soupers outside. The halls were not refined, but they were spirited, places where ordinary Londoners forgot for a few hours the bite of winter and the weight of daily toil. Homes, too, became theatres of entertainment. In parlours across the city, families gathered around crackling hearths for evenings of music and storytelling. The piano was a fixture of middle-class households, and daughters were often expected to provide accompaniment for sing-alongs. Parlour games filled the hours. Charades, card games, or blind man's bluff, punctuated by tea, cakes, and laughter. Winter evenings indoors encouraged intimacy, drawing families closer together under the circle of lamplight. Christmas lent the season a special sparkle. By the mid-19th century, many of the traditions familiar today were firmly in place: decorated trees, carols sung by firelight, and the exchange of gifts. Stories by Charles Dickens, particularly A Christmas Carol, reinforced the image of the holiday as a time of cheer, generosity, and reflection. In churches, choirs lifted voices in hymns, their harmonies carrying warmth into cold stone naves. At home, Families delighted in roast goose or turkey, puddings alight with brandy, and the conviviality of shared feasts. Not all entertainments were lavish. For the poor, winter diversions might consist of gathering in a pub, where a cheap mug of ale offered both warmth and company. Public houses were often crowded in the cold months, their fires drawing in labourers eager for a respite from icy lodgings. Singing, games of darts or skittles, and the simple comfort of conversation filled the smoky rooms. For those with little, community itself was the entertainment, and the hearthside camaraderie was as sustaining as food. The winter season also saw exhibitions and lectures flourish. London's appetite for knowledge was as great as its hunger for amusement, and institutions like the Royal Institution or Mechanics' Institutes offered talks on science, history, and exploration. Crowds gathered to hear about Arctic expeditions, discoveries in electricity, or the latest theories of medicine. To sit in a warm hall, listening to the wonders of the wider world, was a welcome reprieve from the fog-bound streets outside. Even shopping took on the air of entertainment. The arcades of Regent Street and the bazaars of the Strand glowed with gaslight, their windows glittering with displays of luxury goods. Stalls at winter fairs sold gingerbread, roasted chestnuts, and trinkets, filling the air with scents as enticing as any theatre spectacle. Children pressed their noses to the glass, marveling at toys, while mothers sought practical bargains against the cold. Commerce and pleasure intertwine, turning winter markets into social as well as economic hubs. It is worth noting that entertainment in winter carried symbolic weight too. Against the season's darkness, the act of gathering, whether in a glittering ballroom, a raucous music hall, or a humble kitchen, was itself a defiance of nature's severity. Light, warmth, and fellowship became more precious when the nights were long and the winds sharp. A candle lit in a window, a fire in a grate, or a song sung among friends was more than simple diversion. It was reassurance that joy could endure even in the hardest months. To imagine a winter evening in Victorian London is to picture contrasts. One might step from a foggy street, where lamps glowed faintly in the mist, into the golden radiance of a theatre or music hall alive with song. Or climb the narrow stairs of a tenement to find a family huddled together, telling stories by a dim oil lamp while snow tapped at the panes. The world outside was cold, but inside, in countless rooms across the city, warmth was created, warmth of body, of voice, of companionship. Thus, winter entertainments indoors were more than mere amusements. They were lifelines, ways of carrying spirits through the season until spring's first blossoms returned. Whether through grandeur or simplicity, through waltzes in gilded halls or laughter in humble parlors, Londoners discovered that joy, like a fire, burned brightest when it was shared. No feature of London shaped the city's winters more dramatically than the Thames. The river was the city's artery, carrying commerce, water, and life itself. Yet in the coldest months of the Victorian era, it became something altogether different, a stage where the season's beauty, peril, and spectacle played out before the eyes of the metropolis. Though the river no longer froze solid, as it had in earlier centuries, cold snaps still transformed its waters into treacherous channels filled with floating ice. Bargemen spoke of floes grinding against the piers of bridges with a sound like thunder. Timber rafts broke apart, and moored vessels strained at their ropes. For those whose livelihood depended on the river, winter brought danger as well as delay. Crossing by boat was hazardous, and ferrymen sometimes refused passengers when the ice drifted thick. At the same time, the frozen or half-frozen Thames drew Londoners in search of novelty. Crowds gathered along the embankments to marvel at the sight of ice sheets moving downstream. Children hurled stones to test their strength, while adults speculated nervously about whether the bridges would withstand the pressure. The spectacle of the river in winter reminded everyone of nature's latent power. even at the heart of the empire's capital. When conditions permitted, the Thames became a playground. Though never as solid as in the fabled frost fairs of the 17th and 18th centuries, patches of ice near the banks sometimes held enough weight for daring souls. Boys slid across the surfaces, shrieking with glee, while fishermen tried their luck at holes cut into the ice. On rare occasions, enterprising vendors ventured onto thicker sections to sell roasted chestnuts or hot drinks to onlookers. The romance of the old frost fairs lingered in memory, and each freeze revived whispers of their return. Winter also brought dangers from flooding. Heavy rains combined with melting snow upstream could swell the river suddenly, sending icy water spilling into cellars and alleys. Low-lying districts such as Lambeth and Southwark were particularly vulnerable. Families scrambled to raise belongings onto tables, while shopkeepers built makeshift barricades of sandbags and planks. The combination of bitter cold and damp made such floods doubly miserable. To lose coal to the water was a calamity without fuel. A family might face both wet and freezing nights. The river's surface told stories of hardship too. Reports circulated of bodies discovered in icy eddies, victims of accident, despair, or crime. Winter fogs drifting low across the water obscured pathways and bridges, leading pedestrians astray. The Thames, always a place of mystery and melancholy, seemed even more so when cloaked in ice and mist. Its currents carried whispers of lives lost as much as the commerce of empire. Yet the river was also a source of sustenance. Watermen and lightermen found work ferrying goods when streets were clogged with snow. Coal barges continued their slow journeys, vital to keeping fires lit across the city. On the quays, laborers unloaded shipments of grain, meat, and produce, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Even in its most inhospitable state, the Thames sustained the life of London. Artists and writers of the period often seized on the river's winter moods. Painters depicted bridges shrouded in fog, or ice floes glinting beneath a pale sun. Illustrators in popular weeklies sketched crowds gazing from the embankments, or boys skating recklessly on thin ice. Poets likened the drifting floes to ghosts, carrying fragments of forgotten worlds. The river, mutable and mysterious, was never more evocative than in winter. At night, the Thames became stranger still. Gas lamps along the embankment cast halos in the mist, their light reflected in dark waters broken by shards of ice. The slap of oars or the whistle of a tugboat echoed eerily. To walk along the river's edge in January was to feel both the grandeur and the menace of London compressed into a single landscape, beauty and danger intertwined. Silence broken by sudden groans of ice against stone. For those who lived near its banks, the Thames was not an abstract spectacle, but a daily companion. Children of dockworkers grew up with the sight of frost on mooring ropes and the sound of foghorns muffled by snow. Housewives dried laundry indoors, knowing the damp air of the river would never allow it to crisp on the line. Men trudged across slick wharves, their boots crusted with frost, while women fetched water in buckets slippery with ice. The river was both neighbor and adversary, shaping every winter day. If London's streets were the stage of human endurance in winter, the Thames was the backdrop against which those struggles were heightened. It reminded the city of its vulnerability, yet also of its resilience. Barges still moved, ferries still crossed, and the pulse of commerce never ceased entirely. Londoners learned to live with the river's winter face, as they had with its fogs and floods, drawing both sustenance and symbolism from its shifting moods. To picture the Thames in a Victorian winter is to see ice and mist mingling over water, bridges looming like specters, and figures huddled at the banks in awe or fear. It is to imagine a city bound, not just by streets and bricks, but by the broad, restless artery that flowed through its heart. In winter, that artery grew unpredictable, at once sustaining life and threatening it, a reminder that beneath London's veneer of progress, nature still commanded the stage. Winter in Victorian London was not only a season of picturesque fogs and glittering frost, it was, for many, a relentless battle for survival. The cold slowed commerce, froze water pumps, clogged the streets with snow, and made even the simplest forms of labor more grueling. For working-class Londoners, who relied on their hands, backs, and endurance to earn their daily bread, winter meant longer hours, harsher conditions, and fewer opportunities. Take the costermongers, the itinerant street sellers who peddled fruit, vegetables, fish, or odds and ends from barrows. In summer, their cries echoed cheerfully along crowded streets. But in January, the scene was very different. Their barrows creaked over icy cobblestones, wheels slipping dangerously. Customers were fewer, reluctant to linger in the bitter wind, and the produce itself was vulnerable to frost. Apples froze solid, fish turned brittle, and greens wilted before a sale could be made. Many a costermonger lit small braziers beside their stalls, both to warm their hands and to lure passers-by with the glow. Yet, even the strongest fire could not ward off the creeping cold that numbed fingers and chapped lips raw. Other forms of street labor carried their own winter burdens. Crossing sweepers, those who cleared a patch of road in hopes of a penny from grateful pedestrians, found their work doubly necessary in snow or slush. Yet it was miserable work, scraping at frozen muck, spreading sand to prevent slips, and often receiving little reward for their efforts. Newsboys and match girls fared no better, their tiny frames ill, equipped for hours in the chill. With ink, stained hands or baskets of matches, they threaded through the fog, shouting hoarsely against the biting wind, their voices cracking as much from cold as from fatigue. Dock laborers, too, suffered in winter's grip. The loading and unloading of ships did not cease for frost, though it became infinitely harder. Ropes stiffened, water on the decks froze into treacherous sheets, and barrels slipped from grasping hands numbed by cold. Ice along the riverbanks made footing uncertain, and fog obscured signals and lanterns, leading to accidents. Yet dockers could not afford to stay home. They were hired by the day, gathered at dawn in the hopes of being chosen for a shift. A missed day meant no wages, and no wages meant no food. Winter turned the scramble for employment into a desperate competition, with men elbowing one another at the call, on each praying to be selected. Coal heavers endured perhaps the most punishing labor of all. They shouldered sacks of black dust through sleet and snow, trudging up slippery steps to deliver fuel to homes and businesses. The irony was bitter, though they carried warmth for others. They themselves were often cold, their thin coats dusted with coal soot that stuck to damp skin. For them, a day's work left not only aching muscles but a lingering cough from inhaling smoke and dust in the icy air. Not all winter work was brutal. Some saw opportunity in the hardships of the season. Street vendors sold roasted chestnuts, baked potatoes, or hot eels to grateful crowds, their steaming wares both nourishment and comfort. Chimney sweeps found more demand, as families kept their hearths blazing, though the work remained dangerous for the small boys forced up narrow flues. Enterprising tinkers and cobblers offered repairs to boots, coats, and umbrellas battered by the weather, their makeshift stalls brightened by lanterns that flickered in the fog. In a city of millions, even winter's miseries could be turned into a kind of commerce. Still, survival often depended less on work than on endurance. Families huddled together in single rooms, pooling warmth from bodies and blankets. Children were sent to bed early simply to stay under the covers, while mothers eked out meager meals of broth or bread, stretching every penny to keep hunger at bay. The crackle of a fire was the greatest luxury, yet coal was dear and often rationed. Poor families burned whatever they could, broken furniture, scraps of wood, even rubbish, to chase away the frost. Charity played its part as well. Churches and philanthropic societies organized soup kitchens and coal distributions, offering some relief to those in desperate straits. The Salvation Army, still young in the late Victorian years, became a familiar presence with its missions and shelters, ladling out hot meals and providing straw mattresses for the homeless. Yet the need always exceeded the supply. For every family that found a measure of comfort, many more shivered in unheated rooms, their breath visible as they lay awake through the long winter nights. Among the wealthier classes, winter work was of another kind altogether. Coachmen guided their horses through slippery streets, valets laid out thick woolens for their masters, and maids lit countless fires in echoing houses. Even here, though, the cold intruded. Drafts whistled through great halls, and servants who stoked fires often found themselves stationed in the coldest corners. The burden of winter, though not equal, touched every layer of society. Writers and observers of the age took note of this contrast. Social reformers like Henry Mayhew chronicled the struggles of street laborers in his London Labour and the London Poor, recording how the season made the precarious existence of the poor still more uncertain. Illustrated weeklies showed images of ragged children trudging barefoot through the snow, or women huddled under arches with infants pressed to their breasts. Such accounts stirred compassion in some readers and indifference in others. The divide between those who endured winter's hardships and those who merely observed them remained vast. And yet, through it all, London worked. Omnibuses still rolled, their roofs dusted with snow. Markets still opened, with haggling voices rising through the fog. The bell of St. Paul's still tolled through icy air, marking the rhythm of a city that refused to stop. Winter slowed London, but it never silenced it. To survive was itself a kind of work, and the people of Victorian London, from dockers to duchesses, became labourers in endurance when the frost descended. If the streets of Victorian London were harsh in winter, the homes of its people could be equally unforgiving, or, for the fortunate few, havens of warmth and comfort. The way Londoners experienced the cold indoors depended greatly on class and circumstance. A townhouse in Belgravia and a garret in Whitechapel might have been separated by only a few miles. Yet the difference in winter life inside them was immeasurable. In wealthier households, winter was marked by rituals of coziness and display. Servants rose before dawn to lay fires in the drawing rooms, so that their masters might descend to a cheerful crackle of flames. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn against drafts. Thick rugs muffled the chill that crept up through floorboards, and polished brass coal scuttles gleamed beside hearths. Families gathered around roaring fires, sipping tea or hot punch, the air filled with the scent of pine logs or expensive imported coal that burned more cleanly. The firelight lent an intimacy to evenings otherwise darkened by early sunsets. For the elite, winter also meant opportunity for sociability. Dinner parties and musicales were staged in rooms warmed by countless candles and chandeliers, while guests left their heavy cloaks in vestibules attended by footmen. Skating outings were followed by steaming bowls of punch, and children delighted in toy theatres and board games by the fireside. For these families, winter's discomforts could be softened into seasonal charms, a backdrop for leisure and tradition. But for the poor, the scene was starkly different. In the cramped tenements of the East End, cold seeped through thin brick walls and broken panes of glass. Whole families often occupied a single room, the hearth if they had one barely large enough to contain a small fire. Coal was costly, and many made do with scraps of wood scavenged from streets or dockyards. The smell of damp mingled with smoke, and clothing hung stiff with frost on lines strung across ceilings. Children huddled beneath thin blankets, their teeth chattering, while parents wrapped rags around feet and hands. Some rooms had no heat at all. In such conditions, people sought warmth from one another, bodies pressed together at night. The smallest child often tucked in the middle. Laughter and stories still filled the evenings. but they rose from necessity, an attempt to lighten spirits in a world where the cold was unrelenting. Middle-class households straddled the line between comfort and hardship. Respectable clerks or shopkeepers might afford steady coal, yet they still felt the bite of drafts in stairwells and unheated bedrooms. Fires were reserved for parlors and kitchens. Hallways and upstairs chambers remained icy. It was common to see frost lace the inside of window panes, patterns of ice flowers etched across the glass. Children dressed hurriedly in cold rooms, rushing downstairs to breakfast by the fire. Water jugs froze overnight, and washing one's face in the morning was a bracing ritual. Domestic life in winter revolved around the hearth. Families lingered there for warmth. Meals were prepared and eaten nearby, and evenings were passed in close proximity to the flames. Women darned socks, men read newspapers or wrote letters, and children studied by flickering lamplight, all drawn together by necessity. The sound of coal settling in the grate, or the whistle of a kettle, became a kind of music that defined winter at home. Yet fire was not always a comfort, it was also a danger. Poorly tended grates, or makeshift stoves, led to frequent accidents. Children in crowded lodgings sometimes leaned too close to flames and caught their clothes alight. Entire buildings could be lost to fire sparked by desperate attempts at heating. Thus, winter indoors carried risks of both freezing and burning, a cruel paradox that haunted the city's poorest districts. Meals, too, bore the mark of the season. In wealthy houses, roasts and puddings filled tables, steaming dishes offsetting the chill outside. Spices, oranges, and imported delicacies appeared in winter, a display of prosperity. For the poor, meals were sparse and often cold bread with dripping, thin stews, eked out with bones, potatoes baked in ashes. Hot food was as much a source of warmth as nourishment, and a bowl of soup could feel like salvation. The rhythms of winter at home were punctuated by sound as much as by sight. The constant stoking of the fire, the crack of splitting logs, the hiss of steam escaping from kettles. These were the domestic soundtrack of the season. Beyond the windows, the muffled clip of hooves on snow or the mournful call of street vendors filtered in. Inside, laughter or quarrels echoed more sharply in confined spaces, voices carrying through the chill air. Despite hardship, winter at home could also bring moments of intimacy and reflection. Families told stories, sang songs, and shared small pleasures. Even the poor found ways to mark the season: a sprig of holly over the hearth, a candle saved for Christmas Eve, a toy whittled from scrap wood. In those dark months, togetherness itself became a form of survival. In every class of Victorian London, winter reshaped the household. It dictated where people gathered, what they ate, how they slept, and how they dreamed. For some, it was a season of luxury, fires blazing in polished grates. For others, it was endurance in damp, freezing rooms. But whether grand or humble, every home bore the same truth: winter pressed close against the walls, demanding response, shaping lives by its cold hand. As our journey through the frosted streets and fog-laden alleys of Victorian London draws to a close, it is worth pausing to reflect on the legacy of those winters. They were not simply seasons on a calendar, passing like any other. They were formative forces that shaped how Londoners lived, worked, celebrated, and endured. In their harshness, they revealed the city's inequalities. In their beauty, they etched themselves into its memory. And in their relentlessness, they taught resilience to millions who called London home. The Victorian winter was a great equalizer, yet also a stark divider. All Londoners felt the sting of the cold, but how they faced it varied wildly. For the wealthy, winter was a time of glittering soirees, roaring hearths, and seasonal diversions, skating outings, sleigh rides in Hyde Park, and tables heavy with roasted meats and puddings. For the poor, the same frost meant numb fingers, thin blankets, and the gnawing hunger that accompanied both unemployment and high coal prices. Winter underscored the gulf between comfort and deprivation more sharply than any other season. And yet, even in the darkest corners, winter drew out humanity. Charitable societies expanded their reach during the cold months, offering soup, coal, and shelter to those in dire need. Neighbors shared food or blankets when they could. Families, however impoverished, created rituals to mark the season, finding joy in the simplest of traditions. A candle saved for Christmas. A song sung together in the glow of a small fire. The endurance of the poor was a quiet legacy of Victorian winter, one that historians too often overlook. Winter also left its imprint on London's imagination. Artists, novelists, and poets turned again and again to the imagery of fog and frost. Dickens wrote of snow, covered lanes and shivering orphans, his words shaping how generations have pictured Victorian Christmases. Painters captured the eeriness of gas lamps flickering in pea-soup fog, or the majesty of ice-dusted bridges spanning the Thames. Winter became not merely a season, but a character in the city's ongoing story, a haunting presence that defined its atmosphere. Perhaps most famously, the fogs of Victorian winter became the city's emblem. Foreign visitors marveled and recoiled at the thick yellow mists that blanketed London, rendering it ghostly and strange. Though born of coal smoke and damp air, those fogs entered the mythology of the city, immortalized in Sherlock Holmes stories and countless other works. Even long after clean air laws lifted the literal haze, the image of London as the fog-bound city persisted, a spectral gift of its Victorian winters. The legacy of those winters was also technological and political. The hardships they imposed spurred reforms in housing, sanitation, and urban planning. The bitter cold made clear the inadequacies of tenements, the dangers of overcrowding, and the health risks of smoky coal fires. Out of such awareness grew movements toward cleaner fuels, better ventilation, and improved welfare systems. In this way, winter's trials nudged London toward modernization, its very severity shaping the city's future. And yet, the memory of Victorian winter is not only one of hardship, there was enchantment too. The hush of snow falling over crowded streets, the sparkle of frost along iron railings, the thrill of skating on frozen ponds, all these lingered in memory, softened by nostalgia. The Victorians themselves, ever fond of sentiment, cherished such scenes. They looked back on the vanished frost fairs of earlier centuries with wistful longing, even as they made new traditions of their own. Winter's beauty, however fleeting, became part of London's identity. Today, when we picture the Victorian era, winter often rises first in the imagination, chimney smoke curling into pale skies, children in mufflers and boots tramping through snow, hansom cabs rattling through fog. That enduring image is itself a legacy, woven from reality and romanticism alike. It reminds us that seasons are not only weather patterns, but cultural touchstones, shaping how people see themselves and their world. So what remains of those winters now? More than a century later, the fogs have lifted, the Thames no longer freezes, and central heating has banished the worst of the cold indoors. Yet the stories survive, in novels, in illustrations, in the very way we envision Victorian London. To think of that era without its winters would be to miss the essence of the city's character, its toughness, its melancholy, its resilience, and its strange, enduring charm. As you let these images fade, imagine once more the muffled quiet of a snowy night in London, the gas lamps glowing faintly through fog, the crunch of boots on frosted cobbles. Picture families gathered around their fires, rich or poor, each in their own way holding out against the cold. Winter in Victorian London was brutal, yes, but it was also profoundly human, a season of trial and beauty, of hardship and hope, whose legacy still whispers through history. And with that, our journey through those winters ends. May their stories accompany you gently into rest, like snow settling over the city, soft and still.